Welcome back and thank you for staying with us. Now, Cyclone Freddy has killed over 400 people and left tens of thousands displaced in Malawi. The cyclone, which may be the longest on record, has raised further concern regarding climate change. The Hlanganisa Community Fund for Social and Gender Justice says countries around the world need to act urgently to address the crisis. The organization says the humanitarian impact, if felt beyond the declaration of states of disaster. Now, Bongi Ndondo is Hlanganisa CEO and she joins us now virtually. Thank you very much, Ms. Ndondo, for your time here on eNCA. Just firstly, do you think as African countries we are more reactionary when it comes to situations such as this? For instance, even here in South Africa, what happened in KZN during the floods last year, or we have no choice because Mother Nature can surprise you?
Good morning, good evening and good evening to your listeners. I just want to start by just, conveying our condolences to the families that were affected. We do know that it was more than just families, some villages were completely wiped out. So it's a disaster of untold proportion. And we have no doubt that the Malawian people are devastated. It's a very somber mood on the ground. So it's actually very sad. But coming back to your point, I think, we saw this disaster coming. We had this cyclone coming off land and on land the last 35 days. So I don't think that we have any excuse. There's a lot that the Malawian government could have done for its citizens to, first of all, try and avert, some of what we are seeing, the disaster we're seeing, but also to mitigate the impact after it had happened. It's really quite unfortunate that, in spite of all the meteorological reports that we received, still there was no potable water made available. We still have camps that have no sanitation facilities, no, humanitarian aid, no food, no blankets. Some of the schools that are being used currently still do not have decent roofing to protect the people who are in those camps from some of the weather elements. So there's certainly a lot that can be done, and we are very reactional. And I think the point to make is that when these disasters hit, it's more than just the logistical and administrative issue of trying to mitigate the disaster. There's real human rights violations that happen because we find people without water, we find people without housing. There's a lot of sexual violence that is being reported already in some of these camps. And we know because it was the same thing that happened in South Africa when we had our floods in June. So it's nothing new, and there's certainly a lot that governments can do in terms of disaster preparedness.
And I think maybe in comes our infrastructure development and the backlog there, right?
The infrastructure development is a huge issue, and especially for countries like Malawi, because we are told right now that some of the villages that were affected and impacted are still unreachable. There's been the telecoms have been down for days now, almost a week in some of the areas. But some of the bridges were washed away and the roads are are in such a bad condition that even the aid that is available is unable to get to these people. But I can tell you that, it's beyond just those sort of infrastructure issues. We're also told that some of the vehicles have said to villagers, if you want aid, we've got a vehicle, it's got, supplies, but we don't have fuel. We don't have fuel to get to those places. So some of these things are really things that could have been addressed beforehand to mitigate the impact.
And we all know about the maintenance of it, etc. But talk to me about, there was a point when, I had attended something where they discussed how African countries respond to natural disasters, right? Because obviously right now they are worsening. And some journalists were saying that they would go with authorities to these neighborhoods where they would see government officials telling people that they needed to vacate. But because, for people, that's the only home that they have, people would ordinarily refuse to leave their homes and belongings. So what happens in that instance?
I think it's a very difficult one, admittedly, because some of the warnings, villagers were given an option to move. But what does it mean, to move from the only home that you have and leave your belongings behind? So yes, we can sort of, play on that and say people were given the options. But still, when people decide not to move, which is their right, they still deserve and should be given, the humanitarian support in the event of the disaster happening. So I think there's prevention, but there's also mitigation. And what we are expecting right now is for government to be better prepared to mitigate the impact by having those facilities ready, by having those supplies, at hand and ready to be distributed. I don't think it's acceptable that we are hearing that the vehicles that have got this aid cannot get to those places. Why were those supplies not there in the first place is the question we're asking.
And I mean, you look at KZN, for instance, and the flooding there. Till today, there's communities in your Phoenix, etc., who still have no access to water. And some of them say the drinking water that comes out of their taps has a bit of color. So that's also a human rights violation.
It's absolutely a violation. So you're right. I mean, a lot of the people that were impacted in KZN have still not gone back to their normal lives, and this is more than a year later. And again, even in South Africa, we had the storm coming, and in this instance, we already had devastation in Madagascar, in Mozambique more recently. And for 35 days, we were getting reports that this, Cyclone Freddy is on its way. Yes, some of the reports suggested that the severity might be different, but I think there's a lot that our governments are not doing and failing citizens in terms of reaching out to them and being there for them in times of need.
Thank you so much for speaking to us here on eNCA. That was Hlanganisa CEO Bongi Ndondo.